Hello everyone, this is Jeremy Spector. The title of my dissertation project remains Anti-feminism as a forecasting barometer for political radicalization, the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina. For the sake of brevity, I'll refer to the country as Bosnia for the rest of the presentation. First, I want to set the stage. Why Bosnia? Well, due to the country's geography and history, Bosnian society reflects the strong socio-cultural and religious patriarchal traditions of Western Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and the Islamic world. However, since the end of World War II, a variety of social forces, to include the introduction of Yugoslav communism, economic growth, and increasing opportunities for Bosnian women to work outside the home, have altered Bosnia's historical dynamic in which men broadly held women in subservient roles. The collapse of Yugoslavia and the subsequent Bosnian War from 1992 to 1995, followed a decade later by the rise of Islamic extremism in the global consciousness, contributed to significant changes in both the roles and perceptions of women in more traditional elements of Bosnian society. But before we get any deeper into the topic, I want to just step back for a second and highlight the common foundations, the structural foundations that both far-right and religious extremism share. Both religious and far-right / ultranationalist extremists broadly share a common desire to forestall more progressive social movements which threaten the historical social power construct, meaning the historical social power construct in which men dominated society. Therefore, under the guise of protecting women from progressive influences, both religious and far-right extremists broadly seek to disempower women and girls as a means of perpetuating their previously unchallenged social dominance. Social scientists have been able to, at least initially, establish a link between anti-feminism, sexual violence, and radicalization. However, while there has been some beginning of academic research on the topic, there has not yet been a strong academic look, nor has this link been rigorously tested in the context of Bosnia. As a country that's politically divided under the terms of the 1995 Dayton Peace Accords, the country reflects an ideal case study on the topic, with the majority Muslim Bosniak population of Bosnia confronting the threat of radical Islam and the growing far-right ultranationalist movements among the Serb and Croat populations of the country, particularly in the Republika Srpska. Establishing a correlational link between anti-feminism and radicalization would therefore establish for government agencies and civil society organizations a powerful barometer for gauging the threat of radicalization and empowering efforts to short-circuit the process of radicalization rather than responding to it ex post facto. The topic is of has contemporary importance because of the ongoing efforts to counter radicalization in Bosnia. To date, domestic and international entities have been undertaking efforts to counter and prevent radicalization since at least 2015. The organizations currently engaged in these efforts have generally been focusing their attention on preventing radicalization and preventing the travel of radicalized individuals to expatriate combat zones, as well as the reintegration of repatriated fighters. However, I do believe very strongly that focused analysis on the potential relationship between anti-feminism and the propensity towards radicalization in Bosnia represents an important gap in the analysis of countering violent extremism in the country. To date, academics and political scientists have only begun to acknowledge the potentially predictive link between gender politics, primarily anti-feminism, and radicalization. So, determining whether a correlational relationship exists between anti-feminism and a predisposition towards radicalization would close a key gap in the existing body of scholarship on the efforts to counter and prevent violent extremism in Bosnia. Furthermore, researching the potential interrelation between anti-feminism and extremist tendencies could also help to expose the cascading negative effects of misogyny as a social destabilizer with more foundationally caustic consequences for national stability and economic development than is currently understood. So I mentioned the two recent historical dynamics that impact this issue in Bosnia most specifically. The first, during the 1992-1995 Bosnian War, the Bosnian population and government considered itself somewhat abandoned by the Western powers, and therefore turned for support to the Islamic world, specifically Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Libya. As a result, around this time, extremist influences gained somewhat of a foothold in the country. Second, a social mistrust based on ethno-religious identity in post-war Bosnia triggered a wave of radicalization of primarily young people following the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, known as ISIS. But while the rise of ISIS did not influence the practice of Islam in Bosnia, the conflict did attract additional scrutiny due to Bosnia's status as one of only 3 Muslim-majority countries in Europe. Despite that, the per capita contribution of ISIS fighters from Bosnia was well below the European average. According to a 2016 study by the Hague-based International Center for Counterterrorism, the top per capita European contributors were Belgium, followed by France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. So, in other words, the progressive role of women in society have presented a perceived challenge to traditional masculinity and the masculine roles within society. And I mentioned that this isn't purely academic, but an issue with real-world consequences. Bosnia is politically divided based on what ultimately turns out to be ethno-religious lines. So, again, under the Dayton political construct, ethnic division is a fixture in Bosnia. Ethnic divisions create seemingly insurmountable hurdles to the country's socioeconomic stability and make national unity appear almost unachievable. In fact, I would argue that violent extremism represents the worst and the most dangerous form of political division. Therefore, determining whether a correlational and potentially predictive relationship exists between extreme anti-feminism and the propensity towards radicalization in Bosnia, domestic and international entities would be better equipped to design and implement more suitable programming to address what perhaps may be a critical detractor in Bosnia's stalled European Union accession plans. So in order to approach the topic, the research objective, or the goal that I hope to achieve, is to determine whether a correlational and potentially predictive relationship exists between extreme anti-feminism and the propensity toward radicalization in Bosnia. My research questions are: 1. How prevalent is the link between radicalized or formerly radicalized extremists and perpetrators of gender-based violence? Second question is, to what extent do contemporary countering violent extremist efforts address gender-based indicators as a predictor of radicalization? And finally, do the commonalities between right-wing and religious-based misogyny present effective predictors of radicalization? In order to design the research and address a methodology that could effectively reach a satisfying conclusion, my first stop is to build on existing literature to review the linkages between misogyny and radicalization that already exists, with a series of interviews and surveys with formerly radicalized members of Bosnia's radicalized communities, specifically the Muslim community because of increased access. But I would also like to focus, to the extent possible, on members of the far-right community who are now engaged in de-radicalization programs. By juxtaposing anti-feminist views or actions, even if those beliefs are no longer held, at least in the respondents' current position, I would use that as the study's dependent variable, with radicalization as the independent variable. The resulting data set there will address the study's key research questions. So through that combination of the existing literature and new data collection through one-on-one cross-sectional surveys, the study seeks to establish the prevalence of that link between radicalized or formerly radicalized extremists and a propensity towards gender-based violence and anti-feminism. The research methodology will will study two cadres. The first cadre for research and interview would be current and former participants in countering radicalization or de-radicalization programs, with the second cadre being program facilitators. To date, the body of literature is almost non-existent in the Bosnian context, though that is starting to change, and I want to play a part in that. The initial research that addressed the link between anti-feminism and radicalization comes from the feminist movement in the UK around 2016. The human rights activist and British journalist Joan Smith wrote a series of articles in The Guardian in which she said, "Misogyny exists in all communities, but that is not a reason for ignoring what appears to be a specific connection between domestic abuse and terrorism." So her initial inquiry was not particularly substantiated with statistics or any kind of academic research. However, she did start a dialogue that has been since taken up by academics and political scientists in different contexts. So a few years later, 2019, doing research for UN Women, Pablo Castillo Diaz and Nahla Vajji published an article titled "Symbiosis of Misogyny and Violent Extremism, New Understandings and Policy Implications." Their research was worldwide, so it moved from the UK-specific research of Smith to a worldwide look, and started to set the tone for a shift from a journalistic approach to the topic to a more academic look. Interestingly, their research was funded in part by the United Nations under the premise that international governments were struggling to adapt to the new environment in which radicalization was a new topic that they had not yet, did not have the means to address without taking a more broad global look. Since then, a number of researchers at the University of Sarajevo have taken up this topic. There is a 2021 research article called "Gender Ideologies: How Extremists Exploit Battles Over Women's Rights and Drive Reciprocal Radicalization," in which two Bosnian researchers posit that, in fact, the Islamic extremists and the far-right extremists are actually feeding each other's propensity towards anti-feminism, which is very interesting. And I hope to use some of their research as a foundation for my own research. So in the final analysis, radicalized individuals representing both religious extremists and far-right extremists communities see themselves as attempting to prevent shifts in a society in which they view as usurping the natural order of male dominance, according to Dahuila and Kelly. Both are rooted in nostalgia for a time in which traditional patriarchy dominated society. So, therefore, while the justification for anti-feminist behavior may vary, the foundational value is to devalue and disempower women and girls as a means of restoring men to unchallenged social dominance. Reflecting this dominance at its most violent is the dynamic played out in Bosnia, for example, through the use of systemic rape as a tool of war during the Bosnian War, during which reportedly between 12 and 50,000 women and girls and an estimated 3,000 boys and men were allegedly sexually assaulted or raped. So ultimately, the hopeful outcome of this research and its contribution to the body of knowledge is to determine whether a link can be established between anti-feminism and radicalization, thereby addressing the forces that would be important, not only to combat radicalization, but to address the socioeconomic and destabilizing role of anti-feminism. Again, the perpetuation of radicalization of both the far right and among religious extremist communities reflects the dynamic of radicalized forces in which each side sees each other as a threat. And therefore, in determining whether this linkage exists, I believe that we can help to address the trend toward radicalization and provide efforts to stem and stop radicalization with a key tool towards addressing it. Thank you very much.